Tom understood before most boys his age that cultivated men were easiest to deceive when they believed themselves safely among refinements. They mistook taste for wisdom, comfort for control. Horace's office was built from that mistake. It glowed with low firelight and polished silver, with heavy green draperies and shelves burdened by crystal, candied fruit, and decanters fat with old liquor. Rain slid softly down the window panes. The room suggested that ugly things might be made civilized if they were spoken over enough brandy. Horace sat in a velvet chair, broad belly under embroidered waistcoat, his fingers jeweled with rings that flashed when he reached for his glass. Tom, 16 and already practiced in stillness, arranged himself where the fire gilded the cut of his cheek and left his eyes in shadow. "It is only a theoretical question, Professor," he said. The older man laughed too quickly. Theoretical questions are the most dangerous sort in a castle full of clever children. Tom smiled as though delighted by the rebuke. "Then I shall ask it as a foolish child and trust you to answer as a wise man." Flattery relaxed something in Horace. Tom watched it happen. It always happened. Teachers wished to think genius had sought them out not merely for use, but for reverence. Horace adored talent so openly that one could almost see the strings leading into his chest. "Go on, then," Horace said. Tom glanced toward the windows, at the black wash of rain beyond the glass. A girl had died in the castle the year before. The school had learned how easily fear could be redirected when a liar was calm enough. A chamber had opened and closed. A monster had answered him. The memory pleased him still, though not in the childish way violence pleased lesser boys. It had proved method. It had proved blood. It had proved that the old founders had hidden more in stone than sentimental descendants guessed. "What becomes of a wizard?" he asked softly. "If he refuses to die?" Horace gave a genial snort. "Most refuse. It has made no practical difference yet. I mean, refuses in earnest." The fire shifted. The silver instruments on the mantel chimed faintly in the moving heat. Horace's eyes narrowed with something that was not yet fear, but was no longer amusement. "There are old branches of magic," he said after a pause, "best left in old books." Tom lowered his gaze with deliberate modesty. "And if one wished merely to understand why they are best left?" Horace hesitated long enough for caution to become vanity. Tom saw it, leaned on it, and waited. "Murder," Horace said at last, voice dropping, "is said to tear the soul. There are wizards who believe that by placing a torn fragment somewhere outside the body they might protect themselves from death." The room seemed suddenly smaller, as if the dark had leaned in to listen. Tom did not move. "A fragment," he repeated. Horace licked his lips. "An act beyond reckoning. Abomination, really. To maim the soul deliberately." He tried to recover his genial tone and failed. "You ought not even to know the word for such things." Tom looked up then, and the expression he wore was one of pure scholarly hunger, luminous and controlled. "But it has been done. Too often in stories," Horace muttered. "Enough in history to prove stories are not always lies." "Would one fragment be sufficient?" Horace jolted as if slapped. "That is enough. More than enough. You ask as if you mean to inventory butcheries." Tom widened his eyes just enough to imitate innocence. "I only wondered whether the theory had a limit." "There is always a limit," Horace said sharply. "That is what boys like you never believe until the limit is your own face in the mirror." He regretted the words at once. Tom saw the regret and tucked it away with the rest. When he left the office, the corridor beyond was empty and cold, lit at intervals by torches that guttered blue in their iron brackets. He walked with his school robes whispering around his ankles, every step composed. It was not the answer itself that occupied him now. It was Horace's brief expression before the older man mastered it. Disgust, yes, but beneath disgust something more useful. Alarm not at the wickedness of the thing, but at its ugliness. Even in the darkest histories, the method had retained the shape of mutilation. Tom disliked mutilation. He spent the winter in the restricted section, where dust lay thick on chained volumes that remembered fingers long dead. He read until candles guttered to stubs, and the library's silence became dense enough to feel poured around him. He read Greek fragments on Herpo the Foul, whose name had become more legend than man. He read a Moldavian account of a prince who had divided himself once, then again and thereafter could no longer keep his thoughts in sequence, speaking to servants in 3 contradictory voices while rats nested in the walls of the manor where he hid his broken light. He read of a sorceress in the Pyrenees who survived the burning of her body, only to lose the ability to cast without first touching the object that held her torn remnant. Dependence had eaten her long before age did. Again and again, the pattern repeated. Survival purchased by fracture produced not grandeur but degradation. The wizards who used that road became caretakers of their own damage, circling hidden objects like starved dogs around buried bones. They feared scratches, theft, fire, clumsy servants, curious children, damp cellars, loose masonry, war, accidents, time. They became immortal only in the meanest sense, not beyond death, but trapped in terror of interruption. Tom did not fear evil. Evil, he thought, was a judgment made by the weak upon the efficient. What revolted him was dependency. A truly superior wizard would not scatter himself into cupboards and caves. A truly superior wizard would remain whole. That decision, once made, clarified everything. He was not suddenly gentler. He did not stand at a window and discover remorse like some sentimental creature from a moral tale. If anything, his ambition cooled and sharpened, having rejected the vulgar tool in favor of harder craft. He would not hide pieces of himself in trinkets. He would bend older laws. He would seek alchemy that did not require another man's charity, blood magic that fortified without shattering, relics that amplified inheritance and will. He would not crawl around the edges of mortality. He would sit at its table and command it to wait. By summer, he had left school behind with excellent marks, prizes, and the polished reputation of a brilliant orphan whom every respectable witch or wizard preferred to remember as courteous. He returned that season to Little Hangleton beneath a sky the color of pewter. The old gaunt shack leaned against its hill like a rotten tooth. Nettles pushed through broken boards. The stink of old damp and abandonment met him before he crossed the threshold. He found the ring where he had expected, filthy, heavy, crude with the black stone set in its gold. A family relic. A proof. A sneering little crown for blood and grievance. He turned it in his fingers and felt his own pulse steady rather than quicken. The stone fascinated him in some way he could not immediately name. But the ring itself was simple enough. A sign of descent, a token that the line had not wholly drowned in madness. He wore it when he went down to the great house. His father opened the door with his dead mother's face gone hard and stupid in a muggle man's flesh. Tom had imagined the scene often as a boy, not because he needed the man's recognition, but because he preferred, whenever possible, to supply his enemies with the final knowledge of what had found them. The older man did not understand until it was too late. Neither did the grandparents in the bright sitting room behind him, where framed photographs and a clock ticked on with insulting domestic calm. When all 3 were dead, the house went monstrously quiet. Tom stood in the center of that silence with his wand lowered and the ring cold on his hand. The old words from the hidden books drifted near, ready. He had murder enough for the right if he wished it. The soul, Horace had said, is torn by murder. He could do it now. He could take the first cut, set the first fragment outside himself, begin the crude work of becoming unkillable by pieces. Instead, he looked at the bodies and felt, more keenly than triumph, contempt. A king does not survive by scattering his crown into ditches. He slipped the ring into his pocket and left the dead to sour in their comfortable rooms. Outside, evening had begun to gather over the grounds. The yews were black against the dimming sky. Somewhere far off a rook cried from a tree. Tom stood on the gravel drive and let the new name unfold in his mind, not as disguise but as correction, the self he meant to impose on history. Voldemort. He tasted it once in the dark and smiled. Then he turned from the manor and began the long work of becoming feared enough that people would mistake caution for invincibility, and mortality itself for someone else's problem. At Borgin and Burke's, he learned again how greed made fools of people who believed themselves connoisseurs. The shop in Nocturne Alley smelled of dust, tarnish, and secrets that had outlived their owners. Tom was excellent there because he seemed born to reverence objects. His hands were elegant. His voice could make a decayed snuff box sound historical instead of cursed, and an old blood-stained signet seem romantic rather than dangerous. Customers trusted a face like his when it bent over velvet. They mistook the intensity of his gaze for passion about craftsmanship, not appetite. No one ever understood that he did not love the objects themselves. He loved what older magic clung to. Relics were not treasures. They were convergences. Memory thickened in them. Lineage hummed under their surfaces. Human beings might pass laws and build ministries and call themselves modern, but the deep roots of power still wound back through symbols, old houses, old vows, old names. That was why Hepzibah's drawing room nearly stopped his breath. She was vain, rich, and lonely enough to be delighted by a handsome young man who listened as if every family anecdote were sacred history. Her rooms glimmered with inherited silver and portraits fat with self-satisfaction. Perfume and dust mingled in the warm air. House elves shuffled at the margins. Tom sat close enough that Hepzibah mistook concentrated hunger for flattery. "Something very special," she whispered, tapping his wrist with jeweled fingers. "Something much too important to show anyone from the shop. But you, my dear boy, you appreciate beauty." The velvet case opened first on the cup. Small, golden, fine-handled, worked with the badger. There was power in it so old and quiet that even Hepzibah's chatter seemed to dim around its presence. Not dark power, not yet. Older than dark and light both, a residue of making, of mastery, of a founder whose talent had survived in metal long after bones had become dust. Tom's pulse slowed. Then came the locket, serpent-curved and heavy in the hand, marked with the green stone Slytherin had made emblem and warning both. That object answered him differently. It carried blood pride, cunning, secrecy, inheritance, all the things the Gaunts had reduced to squalor but never wholly lost. He felt, absurdly, as if the old founder had hidden a smile inside the metal and was waiting to see who proved worthy enough to hear it. Hepzibah babbled on, proud of lineage she had inherited rather than forged. Tom listened with every courtesy in place, while his future reassembled itself around the two relics on the velvet between them. If Horcruxes were a scavenger's immortality, then this was the architecture of a kingdom. He killed her 2 days later with poison subtle enough that the blame fell where he intended. Poor Hoki wept and confessed what she had not done. By then Tom was gone, taking cup and locket into the dark. He was gone for years. Britain remembered him first as the brilliant boy who had charmed teachers, then as the alarming young man who vanished from respectable employment, then as rumor. The continent took him more usefully. He traveled through Albania, the Carpathians, the old forests of Poland, monasteries half abandoned in the mountains, estates whose libraries had survived both war and fire by being too dangerous for any sensible heir to touch. He found blood rites not yet indexed by the ministry, alchemical speculations dismissed as unsound, because no patient scholar had been ruthless enough to test them, funerary magic preserved in tomb wards and priestly ciphers. He learned which creatures would sell flesh, which would sell prophecy, and which sold neither but could be stripped of knowledge under duress. He also learned the limits of every substitute for eternity. Unicorn blood prolonged but debased. Elixirs failed if the maker died. Possession required weakness in another body and gave too much power to chance. Necromancies preserved command over the dead, not life among the living. All of it was compromise. All of it offended him. The relics remained at the center of his thinking. The cup and the locket were never merely trophies. In his notebooks, written in a hand so controlled it looked engraved, he began sketching a theory of sovereignty rooted in symbolic convergence. Founder magic, blood inheritance, public fear, willing servitude, and a line of death interrupted not by fragmentation but by enthronement. An undivided soul, he wrote once, cannot be hidden. It must be established. It was during those years that Morwen entered his service. She was not the most theatrical of the pure-blood witches drawn to him, and therefore one of the few he ever bothered to notice twice. She came from a respectable family gone threadbare in fortune but not in self-regard, with dark eyes, a scholar's precision, and the dangerous patience of someone who had been underestimated long enough to find it useful. He first saw her in a ruined chapel outside Prague, where masked followers stood among broken saints and guttering lamps while rain hammered the shattered roof. Most of them watched him. Morwen watched the relics on the altar table and the notebooks at his hand. "Your followers think you mean to restore the old order," she said after the others had gone to make ready the dead men he intended to display as warning. She did not sound fearful. She sounded interested. Tom stood by the chapel window, looking out at weeds pushing between gravestones. "And what do you think?" "I think you despise restoration," she said. "Restoration admits loss. You mean to create a thing so absolute that loss becomes treason." That amused him enough to keep her alive. From then on, she copied his notes, cataloged stolen texts, and proved herself both more disciplined and less sentimental than many of the men who swaggered louder. She never mistook his favor for warmth. She never mistook cruelty for chaos. When he punished a failure, she noticed not the spectacle but the lesson. An immortal man might toy with incompetence. A mortal one who intended to rule could not afford it. Britain was ready for him when he returned. Fear had been ripening there for years in the cracks between old families and new laws, between pure-blood grievance and ministry complacency. Tom did not come back as a single warlord marching openly behind banners. He came as disappearances, whispers, sudden allegiance in old drawing rooms, cursed pamphlets on breakfast tables, dark marks over homes. Children taught new silences. He understood something later tyrants often forgot. Terror is strongest before it gains a face. Let people imagine enough horrors, and they will supply your legend at no cost to you. When at last he gathered followers in Britain under his new title, they found not a reckless monster, but a strategist who feared chance more than he feared murder. He struck by proxy whenever possible. He learned schedules, bloodlines, loyalties, debt. He preferred to see his enemies cornered before he entered the room. Some mistook that for theatricality. It was not. Final death waited for every wizard without exception. Tom intended to postpone his own not by superstition, but by control. His inner circle widened and shifted. Old names, ambitious sons, sadists, zealots, opportunists, men and women whose belief in blood had outlived their ability to justify it. Morwen remained among the most silent. She understood the difference between his public mythology and his private obsession. The others wanted a cleansed wizarding world. Tom wanted dominion over time. In cellar meetings and manor halls, he returned always to the same work. The cup, the locket, and later other vanished relics became nodes and diagrams that sprawled over tables. He hunted rumors of Ravenclaw's lost diadem. He revisited his family ring, and the curious black stone set within it, sensing in it a current older than the gaunt's decay. He filled volume after volume with calculations, correspondences, invocations too incomplete to perform safely, revisions too elegant to discard. The phrase appeared more often in those years, written first in Latin, then in English, each time with greater simplicity. The undivided right, not a hiding place for pieces of self, a coronation of the self entire. It might, he thought, take decades. It might require artifacts older and rarer than any living wizard could presently name. It might demand the symbolic submission of a populace and the blood of a foe marked strongly enough to alter fate itself. But unlike the crude solution Horace had let slip in his soft chair, this would not diminish him. It would enlarge him until the world had nowhere left to place a knife. He had almost convinced himself there would be time. Then, in the summer when the war was already devouring families, and the ministry still pretended procedure could answer prophecy. Fate came to him in the voice of a frightened young spy with black hair wet from rain and half a sentence memorized like a wound. The hogshead smelled of sour ale, damp wood, and old secrets. Severus stood halfway up a crooked stair beneath a door that did not quite fit its frame, listening through the narrow seam where warped timber had drawn back from the jamb. He had not been sent there with full trust. Tom trusted very little fully. But Severus was clever, useful, and young enough to slip into places older followers could not manage without attracting notice. An interview for a teaching post at Hogwarts sounded inconsequential. The headmaster-to-be at the school where Tom had once shone might hear things worth knowing. He heard more than he expected. A woman's voice, hoarse with drink yet suddenly sharpened by something unearthly, spilled through the gap in bursts that seemed to tear the air around them. Words about a child, about a vanquisher, about the turning of July, about power the Dark Lord knew not. Then a shout below. Rough hands, the landlord's fury. The door jerked open. Severus fled the stair and the inn in the storm outside with the prophecy half learned and therefore all the more dangerous. Tom listened without interrupting. He stood at the long table in the Riddle house, one hand splayed on pages of his own notes. Candles trembled in silver sticks. Rain moved over the windows like a second skin. When Severus finished, silence thickened so abruptly that he felt he had stepped off a stair in the dark. "A child," Tom said at last. Severus, breathing hard from haste and dread, kept his gaze lowered. "Born as the 7th month dies. 2 children meet that condition this year." "Yes." Tom turned away and paced once to the hearth. The fire painted red bands across his face, and for the first time Severus saw what almost no follower ever dared name. Not anger, not excitement, but fear so controlled it had become cold. Tom had built his life around the refusal of final death. Prophecy was intolerable to him not because it promised challenge, but because it suggested design outside his authorship. "The child of the Aurors," he said. "And the child of the Potters." Severus's throat closed. Tom's mind was already moving. One from old pure stock, one half-blood. One might be raised into safety by respectability. The other, he stopped. A small, terrible smile touched his mouth. The other is more interesting. Severus knew in that instant which child he meant and why. James and Lily. The half-blood mother. Dear. The father whose defiance had made him popular among those who still mistook recklessness for bravery. It was not evidence. It was resemblance. Tom had always read himself into symbols. "My lord," Severus said, and heard the plea in his own voice before he could mask it. "The woman. Spare the woman." Tom turned his head slowly. Candlelight slid over the pale planes of his face. "Ah," he said, almost mildly. "There is sentiment in this after all." Severus hated himself then with a force that made vision blur at the edges. He did not care. Hate was bearable. Lily dead was not. "She was my friend," he said. "Once." Severus said nothing. Tom considered him, seeing enough to enjoy the sight. "If she stands aside, I may permit it." It was not mercy. It was mockery made conditional. But Severus bowed because he had no other weapon to hand and went from the manor with his insides burning. He did not sleep. Before dawn, he stood in a corridor at Hogwarts under cold stone and watched Albus Dumbledore approach through the dim robes whispering over flagstones. The older wizard's face, usually so unreadable that many mistook kindness for softness, became something almost flaying when Severus forced out the truth. "You carried a prophecy to him," Albus said. "I did not know." "No," Albus said. "You only knew the master you serve has filled the country with bodies, and you thought perhaps one more future delivered into his hand might improve your standing." Severus closed his eyes. "Hide them." "All of them?" Albus asked, and that was worse than shouting. "The father as well? The child?" Severus opened his eyes again because he could not endure cowardice and answer at the same time. Yes. For one raw moment, something like disgust flickered in Albus's gaze, and Severus thought he had gone too far, that the older wizard would cast him out or bind him or hand him to the ministry as justice required. Instead, Albus turned toward the high window at the end of the corridor, where early light bled gray over the grounds. "Then help me do it," he said. The Potters went into hiding beneath a charm so old and deep that whole wars had turned upon weaker versions of it. Godric's hollow wrapped itself around them in hedges, church bells, small domestic sounds, and the fragile coziness of borrowed safety. James paced. Lily stood longer than before at windows with the baby in her arms. Their son, round-cheeked and uncomprehending, tugged at her hair and laughed whenever dust motes crossed the light. Only Peter seemed unable to inhabit the fiction of peace. He dropped spoons. He started at owls. He drank too quickly and wiped his palms on his robes when he thought no one looked. The Fidelius charm made him central in a way life never had. The secret passed through him. He could feel the war pressing against that fact from every side. James trusted too fiercely to imagine the shape of certain betrayals. Lily noticed more. At supper, she would turn her head slightly when Peter spoke, as though listening for a note beneath the words. Sometimes, late, when the child had finally slept, she sat by the hearth with a letter in her lap and stared at the flames until James came to kneel beside her and rest his brow against her shoulder. "It won't be forever," he would say. No one alive believed that. Not really. They believed only in postponements. Severus, hidden in Albus's counterweb of spies and half-truths, sent what warnings he could. They were fragments. Tom had become more dangerous precisely because the prophecy had frightened him. He moved with a new impatience beneath his caution. Raids came sharper, deadlier, time to punish delay. Followers who failed him vanished or were found displayed as examples. Old notebooks began to fill with new marginalia in a hand so compressed it looked carved into the paper. Calculations, dates, bloodlines, correlations between the two possible children and those standing around them. He had not abandoned the undivided right. If anything, prophecy only drove him deeper into it. "A marked enemy's blood," he wrote once, "may serve in triumph what it threatens in infancy." It rained for 3 days at the end of October. Britain smelled of wet leaves and chimney smoke and mud. In Godric's hollow, the churchyard yews shone black with water. Lily wrapped their son in blankets and pressed her lips to his soft hair. James made bad jokes in the kitchen because he could feel the fear in the walls and hated it. Peter arrived after dusk and could not meet either of their eyes. The secret changed hands that night in a room where rain tapped the windows and the clock on the mantel marked each second cleanly enough to seem accusatory. James clapped Peter's shoulder. Lily watched Peter's face go gray around the mouth. The child slept upstairs, one tiny fist open on the blanket. Hours later, in another county, Tom stood without moving while a follower whispered the address aloud. When the man finished, Tom dismissed everyone else from the room. Even Morwen went. He remained alone a long time with the candlelight, and the rain, and the house at last within reach. He had killed innumerable people by then. He had made families disappear. He had broken men better than James Potter and frightened women braver than Lily. But this felt different, and not because of the child. The child was merely an infant. What waited at Godric's Hollow was the possibility of final defeat, given shape small enough to cradle. Tom took his wand from the table and closed his hand around it. Then he went to answer prophecy before prophecy could learn how to walk. The cottage at Godric's Hollow had never been grand. That was part of its gentleness. The front room held books stacked in imperfect towers, a lamp with a patched shade, a squashed armchair James adored for reasons Lily could not understand, and a scatter of toys that had begun migrating from nursery to sitting room because Harry had entered the age when a child considered walls advisory. On Halloween evening, the house smelled of stew, wax, and the faint milky sweetness that clung to blankets dried indoors. Harry had refused sleep twice, which James declared a strategic campaign. Lily laughed in spite of herself and carried him upstairs again while rain whispered over the window glass. The child patted her cheek with solemn concentration, then reached for the moon-shaped mobile above the cot and missed, delighted anyway. Downstairs, James had just bent to relight the fire when something in the night changed. It was not a noise at first. It was the absence of ordinary ones. Rain continued, but thinner now, distant, as if heard from underwater. The clock on the mantel faltered. The wind seemed to gather itself and wait. James looked toward the front door. He had no wand in his hand. It lay on the side table near the stairs where he had tossed it after coming in from the garden before dusk, wet and distracted, and too convinced by months of hiding that safety could become habit. The door blew inward. James saw a figure in black framed by rain and darkness, and knew in one clean instant what had been done. He did not call Tom by title. He did not bargain. There was no time, and in James no instinct for it. "Lily, take Harry and go. It's him. Go, run. I'll hold him off." Tom's wand flashed green. James fell in the hall with surprise still on his face. Upstairs, Lily heard the shout and not the curse, because mothers hear danger first in tones and footsteps, and only second in words. She snatched Harry from the cot. He began to cry, startled by the violence in her movement. Her own wand was on the little table by the nursing chair, too far by the time she turned, too meaningless by the time she understood. Heavy steps on the stair. The nursery door burst wide. Tom stood there with rain gleaming on his cloak, and James' blood darkening the hem where he had stepped through it. The small room, papered with faded stars and washed in weak moonlight, seemed to contract around him. Harry cried harder. Lily backed against the cot and held him so fiercely he squirmed. "Stand aside," Tom said. She knew at once what Severus's plea had bought and hated it with her whole being. "Not Harry," she said. "Please, not Harry. Stand aside, and I need not kill you. Not Harry. Please, I'll do anything." Tom's eyes did not change. Whatever fear had driven him here had left no mercy in its wake. It had only sharpened the need. Lily understood then that there are moments when begging and bravery become the same thing, because both refuse the only bargain evil can imagine. She set Harry back into the cot because her arms shook too badly to hold him steady, and turned herself between him and the wand. "Not Harry," she said again, but now the plea was different. It contained no hope of persuasion. It was a vow. "Take me. You won't touch him." Tom lifted his wand. The curse that struck the room should have killed one more woman and ended a prophecy in blood and smoke. Instead, it met something older than calculation. The love Lily chose in that instant did not argue with dark magic. It did not reason, or contest, or duel. It simply stood where death expected obedience and made obedience impossible. For a fraction of a second, the room blazed white under the green. The force of the rebounding curse tore through the nursery, shattering glass, splintering wood, hurling books and toys and plaster into spinning air. Harry felt heat, a slicing pain across his brow, and then nothing that could be named except noise too vast for a child to understand. Tom died there. Not diminished, not cast loose into some maimed half-existence, not clinging to hidden anchors buried elsewhere in the world. The whole of him, body, will, terror, ambition, every unsurrendered piece, met the curse he had shaped for another, and ended in the wreckage of a nursery before a child old enough only to cry. His body struck the blasted wall and slid to the broken floorboards. The wand rolled from his hand and came to rest against a stuffed bear blackened by magic. Then there was silence except for the baby's thin, furious crying. It spread outward quickly, the news. Some magics know when their makers have been extinguished. Dark marks faded on forearms across the country until they were no more than old bruises. Wards broke. Hidden doors sprang loose. Men who had spent years speaking his title in whispers stared at their own skin in disbelief. In one pure-blood manor, a witch laughed until the sound broke into shrieking. In another house, a man locked every room and began burning papers in both fireplaces at once. Somewhere, Morwen stood over one of Tom's open notebooks and went very still. At Godric's Hollow, Rubius Hagrid came first, summoned by Albus before the first celebrations had fully reached the roads. He filled the ruined doorway like grief-given shape. Coat half-buttoned, beard wet with mist, eyes already red. James lay below. Lily lay in the nursery. Harry sat amid broken slats and plaster dust with his face screwed up in outrage, a thin line of blood on his forehead marking where the magic had cut and spared in the same breath. Rubeus scooped him up with hands careful enough to cradle eggs. Harry seized a fistful of beard and wailed into it. Gray, wet tears ran into Rubeus's own beard as he rocked the child. "Yeah, poor little thing," he muttered. "Yeah, brave little thing." Sirius arrived moments later on the motorbike, black hair plastered by rain, eyes bright with wild hope that died the instant he saw the smashed doorway. He nearly fell dismounting. For one terrible second he seemed young enough to be James again. Then he saw the hall, the body, the upstairs ruin, and whatever had kept him upright all year caved inward. "Harry," he said hoarsely. Rubeus tightened his hold. "Albus said I'm to take him. I'm his godfather. I know what you are." Rubeus's voice shook, but his grip did not. "I know what he said." Sirius looked at the child, then at the broken house. Rain dripped from his lashes. Rage and grief fought visibly across his face, neither winning. At last he thrust the motorbike keys at Rubeus with a hand that trembled. "Take it," he said. "It's faster than brooms. Get him clear." He left before he could brake, leaving the bike in the wreckage and a promise of further tragedy none of them yet understood. By midnight, the wizarding world had begun to celebrate in earnest. Owls swarmed between houses with the news. Fire whiskey appeared where it had been hidden. People embraced strangers in the street. Shopkeepers who had closed early for months flung shutters open. Some cried because they were glad. Some because they had no idea what else to do when fear that had shaped their every ordinary hour abruptly vanished. Albus did not celebrate. He moved through the night like a man carrying an invisible weight, from ruin to counsel to arrangements that could not be delayed by joy. Minerva waited for him on Privet Drive in the shape of a tabby cat until the cold finally drove her into human form. The suburban street lay neat and unremarkable under a thin autumn moon, every house squared into prim decency. Behind one darkened window, Petunia slept in ignorance of how history was about to be laid on her doorstep like an accusation. "Must it be here?" Minerva asked when Rubeus's motorbike descended with a growl and a wash of cold air. "Yes," Albus said. "She is the last of Lily's blood, but blood is not kindness." "No," Albus said quietly. "It is not." Harry slept by then in Rubeus's arms, exhausted by crying and shock. In sleep he looked improbably ordinary, the sort of child any street might contain. Only the fresh mark on his brow set him apart, angled like a stroke of lightning where the rebounded curse had touched and failed. Albus took him gently, and felt the weight of him settle into old arms that had held too many children after too much damage. On the doorstep he laid the blanket-wrapped boy with a letter for Petunia and a future no one present could fully foresee. Minerva turned her face away. Rubeus blew his nose loudly and without dignity. Before leaving, Albus looked down once more. The baby stirred, tiny hand opening and closing against the wool. Tom had died for good in a nursery because he had not divided himself. The world did not yet understand the size of that difference. It would feel the absence soon enough. For the moment there was only the sleeping child, the silent street, and the hard bright edge of a peace purchased by a mother's refusal and a dark wizard's final mistake. The days immediately after Tom's fall were not peaceful. They were merely different in the way a house is different after the fire has gone out, but before anyone has begun clearing the rooms. Trials came thick and imperfect. Some followers lied well enough to save themselves behind money, family, and claims of coercion. Others went to prison snarling. The Lestranges and a handful of accomplices, unable or unwilling to accept that their master had truly died, hunted whispers of his survival with torture as their map and left the Longbottom family in ruins. Ministry officials, drunk on relief and authority alike, worked too fast and sometimes too carelessly. Sirius was taken in the wake of a street explosion that left Peter dead to all appearances and 12 muggles with him. There was no trial worth the name. There was only exhaustion and the public hunger for swift endings. Albus watched it all with mounting unease. In the spaces left by open war, he began a quieter labor, tracing Tom backward and downward through the places he had loved, used, and marked. He went to the gaunt shack and found the ring. He went to old storehouses, interviews, records the ministry had barely noticed. He found notebooks in hidden compartments, in false-bottom trunks, in a hollow carved behind a stone at the Riddle house. In them, slowly, a truth emerged that brought him relief and fresh dread at once. Tom had not made Horcruxes. The signs were absent. Objects bearing soul-rent magic felt wrong in specific ways. They resisted touch, throbbed with divided malice, clung to the maker's presence like infected wounds. The ring bore other mysteries. The cup and locket had vanished, and Tom's papers were steeped in dark speculation. But nowhere did Albus find the scar of deliberate soul-splitting. Instead, he found page after page on continuity, enthronement, symbolic inheritance, the terror of dependency, and a repeated title written with obsessive care. The undivided right. Tom had refused the uglier path and sought a grander one. That did not make him less monstrous. It made him more coherent. The black stone in the ring troubled Albus most. Its magic was old, older than the Gaunt's miserable pride, older perhaps than the family itself. Recognition came not as certainty, but as temptation. He turned the ring once in lamplight and thought of his sister. He thought of his mother. He thought of a boy named Gilert, and how long regret could inhabit a man without leaving. Then, with hands that were not wholly steady, he locked the ring away. Some dead belonged among the dead. He had learned that lesson late. He did not mean to unlearn it now. On Privet Drive, meanwhile, Harry grew. He grew in narrowed cupboards of affection and spaces too small for the size of his curiosity. Petunia disliked him not because he was difficult. He was, if anything, unnervingly easy to manage when compared to Dudley's noise and appetite, but because his very existence was a rebuke walking around in hand-me-downs. He had Lily's eyes, and sometimes in certain light that seemed accusation enough. Vernon disliked anything that made the world less simple than drills, sails, and fences. Harry's accidental magic made the world intolerably complex. So he was tolerated in the practical sense, fed, clothed, schooled, and never once properly welcomed. Yet children are not blank pages onto which adults write flawlessly. Harry grew wiry and quick, with a capacity for quietness that often got mistaken for meekness. He learned not to expect fairness, but to notice it when it appeared. He learned how to duck Dudley's gang, how to read grown moods, how to turn loneliness into observation. At night, when the house was finally silent, he sometimes touched the thin raised mark on his forehead and wondered why strangers in odd cloaks stared at him in supermarket car parks with wet, astonished eyes. Letters began arriving in a violence of green ink just before his 11th birthday. Petunia's mouth tightened each time she snatched one from the mat. Vernon turned the color of overcooked ham and boarded up openings with the zeal of a man at war with birds, paper, and common sense. Harry watched the hysteria with a sensation suspiciously close to delight. Whatever was coming had already proved stronger than the Dursleys' certainty, and that alone recommended it. When Rubeus finally came through the storm at the hut on the rock, he arrived like the answer to a question Harry had spent 10 years not knowing how to ask. The night was all wind and salt and thudding rain. Vernon's rifle might as well have been a spoon against the force of him. He stepped inside, dripping and huge and full of an odd, gentle outrage at the sight of the boy. "Harry," he said, as if the name ought to have been enough to make the room make sense. It nearly was. The wizarding world unfolded in quick astonishments after that. Diagon Alley. Cauldrons in shop windows. Wands resting in velvet trays. Gold poured from underground vaults with his parents' name attached to it. People stop in mid-step to stare at him. A wand of holly and phoenix feather in his hand, warm as though it had been waiting. Questions answered and multiplied at the same speed. He learned enough in one day to understand that his life until then had been a small locked box, and someone had just opened the lid. On the train to school, he met Ron over a packet of sandwiches, and an exchange of embarrassment so immediate it became friendship before either boy had time to guard against it. Ron was all elbows, humor, and the weary pride of a child from a large family who had never had the luxury of imagining himself the center of any story. He recognized Harry's fame without envying it enough to become insufferable. That, more than kindness, made Harry trust him. Hermione arrived in their compartment with Neville's toad problem in her arms, and certainly clutched around her like armor. She was brilliant, bossy, and obviously accustomed to surviving rooms by mastering them. Ron rolled his eyes the moment she left. Harry, who knew something about the sound of loneliness under bad manners, was less certain he disliked her as much as he was supposed to. Draco made his position clear before the school year properly began. He did not insult crudely. He had been trained too well for that. He offered distinctions, categories, warnings about the sort of people one ought not to choose. Harry recognized the shape of the trap at once because Privet Drive had taught him how respectable contempt dressed itself. "I think I can tell the wrong sort for myself," Harry said. Draco's smile froze. The castle received them by torchlight and reflected lake water, towering above the first years with all the theatrical benevolence of ancient things that no children will love them whether they are safe or not. The Sorting Hat shouted him into Gryffindor. Ron followed. Hermione joined them after a fretful pause. Neville, to his own astonishment, did the same. The first months were not, as later people like to remember, a smooth march toward legendary friendship. They were awkward and funny and at times exasperating. Hermione knew everything, and often spoke as if the rest of the world had been personally negligent and failing to know it too. Ron bristled. Harry drifted between them, liking both and wishing with some desperation they might eventually stop requiring mediation. He found he loved flying with an almost frightening immediacy, as if the broom answered an appetite in him older than speech. He found he disliked seeing younger students mocked. He found Quirrell ridiculous and Professor Snape terrifying in a way that seemed both personal and inherited from some adult history no child had explained. The bond was sealed not by any grand adventure, but by an accident during the Halloween feast. Peeves, delighted by the anniversary of Tom's fall and his own ability to sour commemorations, chose to unsettle a row of old suits of armor near the side passage leading out of the Great Hall. One came toppling at the exact moment Hermione, fleeing tears brought on by an especially thoughtless remark from Ron, passed beneath it. Harry saw the movement first. He shouted. Ron lunged with him. Between them they dragged Hermione clear as metal crashed and rang across the stones with enough force to send the hall into uproar. Afterward, shaking and covered in dust, Hermione laughed once in disbelief. Ron looked sick with relief. Harry, his heart hammering, realized something had settled into place. From then on, the three of them moved together with increasing inevitability, through lessons and snow-bright courtyards, through whispered debates in the library, through Quidditch matches and exams, and the strange, often comic business of growing at a school that expected 11-year-olds to master dangerous objects with polite attention. They were not always harmonious. Ron could be lazy. Hermione could be unbearable. Harry could be secretive in ways he did not yet understand about himself. But they had, between them, all the ingredients of endurance, loyalty, intelligence, and a shared instinct to stand closer to trouble than wisdom recommended. At Christmas, Albus showed Harry the mirror of Arised. No stone was hidden behind it that year. There was no dark spirit crouched in a teacher's skull, no secret contest in underground chambers. There was only the mirror in a quiet room and Harry, small before it. Seeing Lily and James stand behind him with their hands on his shoulders, and joy in their eyes so vivid, he nearly reached back before remembering. Albus, beside him in the candlelight, did not lie about what the mirror offered. "It gives shape to longing," he said, "and longing is not the same as life." Harry looked at the reflection until tears blurred it, then stepped away because he understood, even then, that to remain would be a kind of drowning. By the end of first year, he had won matches, lost points, gained them back, learned to laugh at certain absurdities of magic, and discovered that being famous was less like being important than like being misremembered by strangers. Many wanted him to be a living trophy of victory, proof that evil had ended on schedule and neatly. He was only a boy at school, thin from growth, happier on a broom than in any crowd, and beginning to suspect that the peace he had inherited was real enough to enjoy and fragile enough to require guarding. On the night of the leaving feast, candles drifted above the tables in warm constellations, while summer pressed gold through the high windows. Ron fell asleep in his chair before pudding. Hermione pretended not to notice how often she checked that his goblet would not spill. Neville grinned so hard his face seemed permanently altered. Harry looked up at the enchanted ceiling and thought, with a sudden fierce gratitude, that for a little while the world had allowed children to be children again. He did not know then how temporary every ordinary blessing was. The absence of Tom did not make childhood uneventful. It made it differently vulnerable. Harry's second year passed under rumors instead of monsters. Someone painted slurs on corridors after a debate in the Daily Prophet about heritage standards in magical education, and idea Lucius floated with the easy deniability of a man who preferred poison diluted through bureaucracy. There was no basilisk in the walls, no bewitched diary, no voice only Harry could hear. Instead, there were uglier, more ordinary things. Muggle-born students made to feel watched, letters arriving at the school full of filth and lineage charts, governors murmuring about discipline, as if prejudice were a problem of tone. Hermione weathered it with chin high and eyes flashing. Ginny, shy in most company and not at all shy where injustice was concerned, hexed a third-year Hufflepuff into hiccuping slugs for a full afternoon after he called Hermione a mudblood under his breath. Harry liked her fiercely for that. By third year, the past tore its way back into his life with more teeth. The summer before term, a photograph in the Prophet showed the Weasley family in Egypt, all smiles, sunburn, and waving elbows. In one corner, on Ron's shoulder, a rat with a missing toe peered straight at the camera. In Azkaban, where hope went to rot and madness paced the corridors like a jailer, Sirius saw the image and finally found what years of grief had not given him: direction. He escaped not for freedom, but for Peter. The country panicked. Dementors glided into station platforms and school grounds in greater numbers than anyone sensible considered wise. Harry's first close encounter with one on the train left him shaking and bewildered by a flood of cold that seemed deeper than weather. The things dragged memory to the surface and made sorrow feel present tense. Remus Lupin, thin as if life had been feeding on him from the edges inward, entered his compartment with a bar of chocolate and a steadiness Harry trusted almost instantly. Remus was the best defense teacher Hogwarts had seen in years. Perhaps that was because he understood fear as a practical matter rather than a dramatic one. He did not posture. He taught. With him, dark creatures became knowable enough to confront, not trivialized but handled with respect. Harry worked hardest in those lessons because the Dementors had touched some hidden wire in him and left it vibrating. Under Remus's guidance, he learned the shape of a patroness, at first no more than mist, then brighter, clearer, silver, trying to become certainty. "Think of something that is truly yours," Remus told him one evening in an empty classroom washed blue by moonlight. "Not someone else's story about you, not what you ought to represent, yours." Harry thought of flying. He thought of Ron's helpless laughter when he choked on pumpkin juice. He thought of Hermione falling asleep on a book and denying it when woken. He thought of Ginny grinning through wind on a borrowed broom. He thought of Sirius, in letters he had never had but suddenly wanted. Something bright leaped from his wand, stag-like for a glorious second before dissolving. Remus smiled, tired and proud. Again. Around them, the year tightened. Sirius was seen near the castle. The fat lady's portrait was ripped. Snape grew more venomous as old histories moved closer to the surface. Hermione acquired a dangerous look of overextension and refused to explain it. Ron's rat became increasingly frantic. Harry's dreams turned muddy with glimpses of pursuit and betrayal he could not place. The truth broke open in the shrieking shack, as ugly truths often do, in a place already burdened by too much rumor. Sirius was not the raving murderer the prophet wanted. He was gaunt, filthy, and held together by purpose alone. When he first turned those hollowed eyes on Harry, the room seemed to lurch under the weight of all the years stolen from both of them. "I would never have hurt you," Sirius said, and the rawness of it made Harry believe him before reason had finished assembling evidence. Peter, dragged from rat form by force and fear, collapsed into exactly what he had always been beneath whatever charm had hidden him. A small man with quick eyes, clammy skin, and the sort of cowardice that tries on every available expression in search of the safest. Remus arrived breathless and transformed the room simply by entering it. Old friendship, old grief, old fury. All of it crossed his face at once when he saw Peter kneeling there. Snape came too, wand drawn and hatred ready, but hatred proved insufficient against facts when enough of them piled together. The night might still have gone wrong. Remus' transformation loomed, the moon fat beyond the broken windows, but Hermione, white-faced and shaking, remembered the wolfsbane in Snape's bag and shouted it in time. Ginny, who had followed farther than anyone knew, stunned Peter just as he bolted. Sirius, Remus, Harry, Ron, Hermione, and even Snape by grudging necessity emerged from the shack with the traitor alive and the story intact enough to force daylight through official lies. Peter stood trial. Veritaserum did what conscience had never managed. Sirius' name was cleared with embarrassing speed once the Ministry understood how badly it had erred, and how much that error might cost it politically. The public devoured the scandal. Some pretended they had always doubted his guilt. Harry learned then a lesson adulthood would only confirm. Most institutions apologize not because truth moves them, but because exposure does. Still, Sirius was free. Freedom did not make him whole at once. Azkaban had hollowed rooms inside him that no legal correction could refill. But he laughed more quickly than Harry expected, loved more recklessly than was probably healthy, and took to the role of godfather with a hunger that was equal parts devotion and grief. He had James' arrogance filed into protectiveness, and the same capacity to adore Harry in ways both uplifting and inconvenient. That summer, Harry spent a fortnight with him in a small country house the Ministry had reluctantly agreed not to monitor like a prisoner's cell. Sirius showed him photographs, trunks of old school things, letters from Lily tied in ribbon gone soft with age. Harry read them with an ache that was not cleanly sorrow or joy, but both braided together. He also discovered that Sirius and Remus, when left alone together long enough, slipped into the kind of shorthand only deep history produces, full of unfinished jokes and silences that were not empty. Lucius watched all this from the other side of the political world with mounting irritation. Sirius free meant old noble respectability restored to the wrong side of the war. It also meant one more witness against the narrative men like Lucius preferred, that the past was closed, regrettable in the abstract, and best left to those prosperous enough to curate it. He moved more carefully after that, softer in public, deeper in committees, his influence spreading like frost where speeches would have been too obvious. Harry entered his fourth year with more than he had possessed before. A godfather, a living map of his parents in the form of friends who remembered them, a Patronus bright enough to trust, and an increasingly sharp sense that the peace of the wizarding world was maintained not by forgetting evil, but by noticing how it changed its clothes. He also had a growing circle of people for whom he would, if asked, do something spectacularly unwise. That turned out to matter. By the time the Truewizard tournament came back to Hogwarts, Harry had become used to the strange doubleness of his reputation. To half the country he was forever the baby in the ruined nursery, the emblem of a war that ended cleanly because his mother stood where she did, and Tom had not learned how to survive his own curse. To the people who knew him, he was a 16-year-old with a talent for flying, an increasing gift for defense, a quickness to anger on behalf of others, and a persistent inability to mind his own business where mysteries were concerned. The tournament was supposed to be a gesture of renewal, international cooperation, friendly rivalry. a symbol that the generation growing up after the First War might inherit something grander than recovery. Albus approved with visible caution. The ministry adored the optics. Hogwarts filled with foreign students and banners, and a temporary mood of festival that put everyone just slightly off balance. Cedric Diggory carried it best. He moved through attention as if born to it, handsome without vanity, brave without any need to advertise the fact. Had Harry been selected instead, as in certain nightmares of public expectation, the year would have become miserable beyond tolerance. Instead, he got to watch Cedric carry Hufflepuff hopes with easy decency, and discovered that admiration is a simpler thing when one is not forced into competition first. The Yule Ball came in a spill of torchlight and nerves and borrowed finery. Ron looked mutinous in old dress robes. Hermione descended a staircase and silenced half the room by existing in a different register than they had previously understood. Ginny, no longer shy in quite the same way and amused by Harry in a manner that put him off his stride, wore red gold and laughed with people who had once overlooked her. Harry himself spent most of the evening trying to appear less awkward than he felt, and failing with intermittent charm. It was during the second dance that he saw Morwen. He did not know her name yet. He knew only that she was too still for a guest, too attentive for a parent, and dressed in deep green velvet that should have softened her and somehow made her look more dangerous instead. She stood at the edge of the floor near one of the great pillars, speaking to a ministry official whose smile had the brittle quality of someone desperate to please. Her gaze passed over the dancers, the visiting delegations, the candles, and landed on Harry with a recognition that felt like the touch of a cold finger between his shoulders. When she smiled, it was not warm. It was appraising. "Who's that?" Harry asked. Hermione followed his glance. "I've seen her in the library talking to Professor Dumbledore. Or near him, anyway. She's some sort of antiquities patron. Donated a whole collection of manuscripts to the Ministry archives last year." Nah. Ron frowned. "She looks like she'd donate manuscripts after poisoning the previous owner." Harry laughed, but the unease stayed. The tournament tasks came and went in a blur of dragons, lake water, and hedges. Cedric performed brilliantly. Fleur and Victor each had moments that made the school collectively forget its allegiances in favor of applause. Harry cheered from the stands and helped where he could, which turned out to mean research for everyone and emotional support mostly for Cedric, after the first task singed off half his dignity along with a fair amount of hair. All through that year, meanwhile, quiet violence threaded the edges of the spectacle. A retired collector in Bristol was found dead beside an open safe. Nothing obvious had been stolen except a stack of old-school exercise books no one thought to value until later. A curator in the Ministry archives vanished for 3 days and returned with no memory of where he had been and a singular terror of green velvet. A locked cabinet in Hogwarts' own restricted storeroom showed signs of tampering so subtle only Hermione noticed the dust had been disturbed. Harry brought that to Albus. The older wizard listened without dismissing it and seemed, if anything, more troubled than surprised. "Do you know the woman in green?" Harry asked. "Yes," Albus said after a pause. "I'd had hoped not to need to introduce you." That was not an answer. It was, Harry had learned. Albus's way of admitting the answer mattered badly enough to withhold until he had no choice. The final task ended in cheers, mud, and Cedric's well-earned victory. He emerged from the maze, panting, scratched, and holding the cup high while the stands thundered. No graveyard waited for him. No trapdoor in fate opened under his feet. Harry, applauding till his hands stung, felt relief so powerful it was almost giddy. The world could be ordinary, he thought. Dangerous, yes. Uncertain, absolutely. But ordinary in the sense that boys who entered tournaments might survive them and grow older and have stories to tell over butterbeer one day. That hope lasted 3 nights. On the 4th, a message reached Albus through channels Harry was not supposed to know existed. Sirius arrived at the castle after midnight with rain on his coat and a wand already in his hand. Snape, summoned separately, looked murderous from habit and pale from something deeper. They vanished into the headmaster's office and did not emerge for an hour. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, who had long ago ceased respecting doors when danger might be on the other side, waited under the staircase and heard only fragments through stone and phoenix song. Exercise books. His cipher, unmistakably. Not merely one notebook, Severus, a sequence. She copied them years ago. I told you she was clever. Hermione gripped Harry's sleeve hard enough to hurt. Yes? Albus found them there when the meeting broke. He was not angry. That was how Harry knew whatever had happened was worse than a reprimand. Come with me, he said. The office seemed changed by the hour it had just held. Fawkes watched from the perch with eyes too bright for sleep. On the desk lay a thin black notebook, covered in slanted, careful handwriting, and a scrap of velvet darkened by age. Sirius stood at the window with his jaw clenched. Snape, arms folded, looked as if remaining in the same room with all of them cost him effort. Albus did not waste time. When Tom was a student, he said, he asked questions about Horcruxes. Harry glanced at Hermione. Her face went white with fascination and horror. But he did not make them, Albus continued. I am as certain of that as one may be in this world. He found the method beneath him, too mutilating, too dependent. Instead, he sought another road. He opened the notebook and turned it so they could see. The page was full of diagrams that looked half astronomical, half heraldic. A cup, a locket, a ring, and a crown-like diadem. Lines of blood, circles of witnesses, sigils built from death and inherit. The undivided right, Hermione read aloud. His attempt, Albus said, to enthrone the soul without dividing it. Founder relics. Symbolic convergence. Fear as collective force. Blood as key. He never completed it. Prophecy interrupted him first. Harry stared at the page until the ink seemed to move. And the woman in green? He asked. Morwen Selwyn, Snape said. The name fell from him like something sour. She copied his private researches during the First War. Everyone thought she was merely devoted. We were foolish. Sirius turned from the window. A collector in Bristol had another notebook. She killed for it. Harry's pulse had begun to pound. Why now? Ron asked. Why not years ago? Albus met Harry's eyes. Because Tom died before he could refine the ritual. And because some magics require not merely the presence of an enemy, but an enemy already marked by a near-fatal exchange. The child he chose. The blood that unmade him. The room went still. Harry looked back down at the diagrams and felt with sudden terrible clarity that the war had not ended so much as left behind seeds in the dark. Tom himself was gone, but his fear had been preserved in notebooks, his ambition in relics, his unfinished reach in people clever enough to mistake coherence for greatness. Outside the office windows, the summer night over Hogwarts remained mild and star-filled. Students laughed somewhere below, carrying late feast fragments back to their dormitories. Cedric, perhaps, was being congratulated for the 100th time. The castle stood intact, warm, crowded with life. Inside the office, Harry understood that something old had just begun again. But this time, it would not be a man returning from death. It would be an idea trying to inherit the world. The Ministry's response to Morwen was exactly what Albus had predicted, and Harry had half expected. Public minimization, private panic, and a bureaucratic attempt to control the story by controlling the people most likely to tell the truth about it. No one wanted to admit that a coherent Neo-Death Eater movement had survived the war not in open fanaticism alone, but in archives, salons, committees, and family vaults. Such admissions were expensive. They embarrassed the Ministry, threatened influential donors, and suggested that peace had required more vigilance than officials had spent the last decade congratulating themselves for providing. So the line became one of isolated incidents, deranged collectors, exaggerations from Hogwarts, and an unfortunate tendency in certain older wizards to dramatize every stolen artifact into an omen. Dolores Umbridge arrived that autumn in pink velvet and smiling tyranny to ensure the school did not contribute further to any such dramatization. She called herself a corrective. She was in practice the ministry's effort to replace courage with procedure. Defense became theory. Meetings required forms. Student organizations found themselves denied on technicalities so petty they took on the nature of insult. Albus's authority was trimmed where it could be. Snape withdrew even further into acid silence. Harry, who had inherited a visceral distrust of respectable cruelty from both the Dursleys and experience, loathed Dolores on sight. So, by November, they were meeting in secret. Hermione organized it because organization was the shape her defiance naturally took. Ron carried the practical burdens and grumbled at them like a sacrificial saint. Ginny joined without hesitation. Neville came because anger had been ripening in him for years beneath diffidence. Luna drifted into the room of requirement as if she had always known the door would want them eventually, and suggested, with airy good sense, that people frightened by conspiracies ought to learn more offensive spells, not fewer. Harry taught because he could. The room they found for those meetings was warm with torchlight and furnished with battered dummies, shelves of cracked spellbooks, cushions on which nobody ever sat, and enough open space for mistakes to become lessons rather than disasters. There, under the castle's sleeping stones, the students practiced shields and stunning spells and disarming charms until wands moved less from panic than habit. Harry discovered that what he had learned from Remus, from Quidditch, from near disasters and watching adults lie, could be translated. Fear shrank when named aloud. Hands steadied when given purpose. If Dolores represented the ministry's faith that children could be rendered safer by being made helpless, those hidden evenings became a quiet rebuttal. Outside Hogwarts, Morwen moved with colder ambition. Safe houses were searched. A historian who had corresponded with Hepzibah's descendants was found memory-charmed and half-frozen in a lane. An old cave on the coast yielded signs that someone had reached it before Albus did, and left furious at finding what was not there. Lucius's name surfaced repeatedly in whispers, and never quite in admissible proof. He spoke against alarmism in the Wisengamot, with all the silky assurance of a man financing it elsewhere. In the spring, Albus asked Harry to come with him. Not because he intended to burden a child with what adults ought to bear, though Harry had become old enough to resent that assumption in either direction. Not because prophecy demanded it. Because the notes Morwen had stolen suggested that Tom, long before Godric's Hollow, had used one place repeatedly as both memory and symbol. And because Harry had the rare combination of nerve, trust, and moral stubbornness that made him useful when older brilliance turned inward on itself. The cave lay by a slate-gray sea under a sky bruised with cloud. Harry recognized the place only from description after Albus named it, where Tom, as a child from the orphanage, had once terrorized others into silence. He had chosen it later to conceal the locket because men like him always returned to the first room in which power had seemed uncomplicated. They crossed black water in a narrow boat. The cavern smelled of salt, stone, and old enchantment. In the center, an island held a basin cut from rock, and in the basin a potion dark as ink waited above a submerged gleam. Inferi moved under the water's surface like thoughts too slow to become action. Harry had heard the story of this place in one of Albus's reconstructed memories, but standing there made all narratives inadequate. The magic in the cave was not only lethal, it was intimate. It reflected Tom with a precision more horrifying than spectacle, the child who had learned fear by teaching it, the man who could not imagine value not measured in domination. The potion did not conceal a Horcrux. It concealed memory and threshold magic keyed to pain. Albus drank because there was no other way. What it forced from him was not physical agony alone, but vision, regret, temptation, the old wound of family. Harry held the basin when the older man's hands shook and listened as fragments escaped in a voice stripped of every civilized layer. Ariana. No, not again. Harry had never heard him sound small before. When the potion was gone, the basin yielded the locket. It lay in Harry's palm, heavy and cold, Slytherin's mark seeming almost to watch. The moment it left the basin, the water erupted. Inferi surged up in a ring of gray hands and open mouths. Harry shouted, Fire exploded from Albus's wand in sheets and spirals, turning the cavern briefly into a furnace of gold and shrieking steam. They escaped by inches, by reflex, by the raw immensity of Albus's power and Harry's refusal to let go when any sensible boy might have fled with the object alone. Back at Hogwarts, soaked and shivering, Harry thought the worst had passed. He was wrong. 3 nights later, Grimmauld Place, where Sirius had offered rooms, tea, too loud laughter, and eventual strategy to half the people Albus trusted, was attacked from within. Not by open force, by theft. The locket vanished from the locked study where it had been laid for examination. A house elf swore he had seen nothing. Ward stood intact. Snape, called before dawn, looked at the empty case for one long moment and said, with something like admiration sharpened into contempt, "She has someone very close." The months that followed became a narrowing corridor. Dolores's control of the school intensified. Students learned anyway. Morwen acquired the locket. Lucius escaped questioning once more. Neville's grandmother was hexed in her own greenhouse by masked intruders looking for family papers from the war. Luna's father published an article so direct about ministry corruption that officials raided his house under pretext of licensing irregularities. Cedric, now out of school and training with the Department of Magical Games, smuggled messages when official channels proved too porous. Ginny learned curses she should not have known so young and cast them with infuriating excellence. At Christmas, Albus brought out Tom's surviving notes and laid the problem bare. "He had the locket and the cup," Hermione said, tracing the diagrams. "The ring has a family emblem. He hunted the diadem. Founder magic, Slytherin blood, public fear, and the blood of the child who survived him. Men... Gah. Not the child," Harry said quietly. "The enemy." Albus nodded. "More precisely. Luna, who had been invited because she had once solved a runic substitution the rest of them missed by assuming the writer was both vain and frightened, tilted her head over a page. He wanted the relics to agree he belonged to them. Hermione looked up sharply. "That's it." It was. Tom's great error had not been merely moral. It had been interpretive. He thought symbols could be owned by force because he understood power as ownership. Morwen, from the evidence of her annotations, agreed. "She'll need the diadem," Hermione said. "And the ring." "The ring?" Albus said. "She will not have." He did not say why the black stone mattered beyond blood and lineage. Harry suspected there was more in it than the others knew. He also noticed the way Albus's fingers paused over the ring box before he set it aside again, as if temptation still remembered the shape of his hand. By spring there could be no pretense left. Morwen had 2 relics. She wanted the rest. The ministry still lied. Hogwarts trained in secret. And Harry, standing in the room of requirement one night before a line of students practicing shield charms under candlelight, understood with a calm that surprised him that he was no longer waiting for adults to solve the world before it reached him. It had reached him years ago in a nursery. Everything since had merely been the slow discovery of what answer he meant to give. The diadem had been at Hogwarts all along. Once the possibility entered Hermione's mind, it reoriented half a dozen details that had floated uselessly for years. Tom's old interview with Albus for the defense post. The boastful way he had once spoken of knowing the school's deepest places. A line in one notebook, describing the shabber where 1,000 forgotten things make a monarch's shadow. Only Tom could have written a sentence so pleased with itself. Only Hermione could have treated it as a clue instead of style. The room of requirement yielded the diadem reluctantly, after leading them through mountains of abandoned furniture, cracked, vanishing cabinets, outdated cauldrons, trunks of moth-eaten dress robes, and enough lost homework to wallpaper a small kingdom. Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Ginny went together beneath the thrum of the castle asleep around them. Neville stood watch. Luna had suggested they carry 3 kinds of fire and a mirror, in case the room decides to become symbolic. None of them mocked her anymore. They found the diadem on a bust beneath a wig gone gray with dust, its metal still delicate and proud under centuries of neglect. Blue stones winked in their torchlight. Ravenclaw's relic did not feel dark the way cursed objects did. It felt awake. The moment Hermione lifted it, the room shifted. Crates toppled. Flames burst from 3 separate points at once, unnatural, hungry, snaking through piles of forgotten things as if guided by spite. Someone else had entered. A masked wizard sprang from behind a broken wardrobe with wand already raised. Ginny hexed him in the throat before Harry even turned. Ron dragged Hermione clear of a falling cabinet. Fire took shape in the air with the mouths of beasts. "Fiend fire!" Hermione shouted. They escaped by the edge of disaster, Harry shoving the diadem inside his robes while the room roared itself to ruin behind them. Their attacker did not survive his own fire. On the floor outside, while alarms began to ring through the corridor and portraits woke in outrage, Ginny tore the man's mask free. No one they knew. A hired zealot, then. Morwen's reach had widened. That same night Snape arrived in Albus's office with soot on his sleeve and blood at his temple. He looked less like a teacher than a man who had walked through a lie that had just caught fire behind him. "She knows you have the diadem," he said, "and she moves tomorrow." No one asked how close he had been to her to learn it. Some services in war become more terrible when described. The final pieces came together too quickly afterward to feel real. Morwen had the cup and locket. She had sufficient followers to stage diversions in Hogsmeade and on the roads out of London. She had Lucius's money, though not perhaps his full obedience anymore. Men like Lucius discovered too late that financing fanaticism does not guarantee control of it. She knew the diadem was at Hogwarts, and the ring remained with Albus. Most crucially, through some combination of theft inference and old records from Peter's betrayal, she knew where Tom had intended the undivided right to culminate, if ever the conditions ripened. Not at Hogwarts, not in a ministry chamber, but at the Riddle graveyard in Little Hangleton, where bloodline, murder, and chosen enmity all crossed. "She thinks the place itself will answer him," Sirius said with disgust. "No," Hermione replied, eyes on the diagrams. "She thinks it will answer her." It rained the night they went. Rain had framed every turn in the story from the moment prophecy first touched it. Rain on the Hog's Head roof. Rain at Godric's Hollow. Rain now over the graveyard where the yews bent, and the earth darkened, and old stone names shone slick in wandlight. The air smelled of mud, wet leaves, and the metallic bitterness of powerful magic already at work. Morwen had built a throne from roots and broken marble at the center of a ring carved into the ground. Runes burned red in the trenches. Around them, masked followers chanted in a cadence too low to be language and too deliberate to mistake for prayer. The cup stood on one stone pillar, the locket on another. On a third, empty yet prepared, waited a space for the diadem. A fourth held an iron socket shaped for the ring. She stood within the circle in black-green robes that drank the night around them, hair unbound in the rain, face as composed as if this were a formal reception and not a necromantic coronation. Captives knelt at the perimeter, not children, thank God, but adults taken from road raids and manor sieges, witnesses and fuel both. Among them Harry saw a ministry archivist, a shopkeeper from Nocturne Alley, and Cedric, bruised but glaring with intact contempt. Morwen smiled when they appeared between the gravestones. "Right on time," she said. "Tom always did prefer symmetry, and I have learned to admire it." Snape moved half a step forward and stopped when one of her followers pressed a wand harder into Cedric's neck. "You were warned never to improvise," Morwen said to Snape without looking at him. "I rarely take instruction well," he replied. She laughed once, softly. "Yes, that is why he never trusted you all the way." Albus stood with the ring hidden in his sleeve, and the diadem under Harry's cloak. Sirius flanked Harry on one side, Ginny on the other, Ron and Hermione slightly behind, where they could see the whole circle. Snape at a dangerous angle, no one fully believed until the first curse flew. "Release them," Albus said. "Of course," Morwen said. "At the proper stage." Rain ran from her lashes and did nothing to blur the precision of her gaze. She looked not at Albus first, but at Harry. "Do you know what Tom understood before any of your beloved heroes?" she asked. "That mortality is the root vulgarity. It makes every compromise meaner, every love smaller, every institution cowardly. Death teaches obedience to limits." He rejected the scavenger's solution, quite rightly. He sought sovereignty entire. "Nah, I day." He sought to avoid ending, Harry said. "That's not the same thing. A flicker, almost pleasure." "Good. You do learn quickly. From better people." Her smile thinned. "Better? People who accepted the world as it was because changing it required blood on the floor? Please. Your side sanctifies suffering only because it has never had the discipline to abolish it." Hermione made a tiny sound of fury. Ron's wand hand whitened. Sirius looked ready to leap the circle and be damned. Albus alone remained still. "The dead are not abolished by denying them," he said. Morwen turned at last to him. "No, Albus. They are mastered by refusing to kneel." With that, she moved. The chant surged. Wands flashed. The graveyard exploded into battle. Snape's first curse took the masked wizard holding Cedric. Sirius hurled himself toward the captives. Ginny dropped to one knee and sent a slicing hex low across the mud that cut through 2 ankle tendons and collapsed an entire section of the chanting ring. Ron blasted a headstone into fragments that knocked 3 followers sprawling. Hermione screamed a warning and the ground under Harry's feet opened with roots like snapping fingers. Morwen was on him in an instant. She moved with terrifying economy, every gesture practiced. One curse from her wand sent the diadem flying from Harry's grasp into the waiting pillar. Another knocked Sirius back hard enough to crack marble. Harry shielded on instinct, felt the shield shatter, rolled, came up in mud with her next spell burning past his ear and taking bark from the yew behind him in a spray of splinters. "Alive!" she called to her followers. "He is no use dead." That command saved him 3 times in as many seconds. He dueled backward, rain in his eyes. The graveyard a strobe of green, red, gold. Cedric, freed, seized a dropped wand and joined Ron at the perimeter. Hermione made for the runes rather than the duel, dropping to trace countersigns in the mud with one bleeding hand. Ginny fought like Joy turned blade. Snape met Lucius near the chapel wall. Lucius at last openly present, pale with rage and fear that his investments had matured into personal peril. Their curses lit the rain between them like shattered glass. Albus reached the center and took the ring from his sleeve. Morwen saw and changed. For the first time, real hunger stripped the composure from her face. "There," she breathed. "At last." She slashed her wand through the air. A curse hit Harry in the forearm, hot and clean as a knife. Blood ran instantly down his wrist. The ring socket blazed. The cup shone gold. The locket flared green. The diadem awakened in a burst of cold blue light so bright the graveyard reeled around it. Blood hissed when it struck the carved circle. Morwen lifted both hands and the roots of the throne rose behind her like a crown of thorns. "This," she said into the storm, "is how the age of compromise ends." Harry, arm burning, understood the trap in full. The rite wanted not merely his blood but his unwillingness, the old violence repeated and inverted. The child marked by Tom forced at last to legitimize Tom's unfinished dream by resisting too late. Fear from the captives and fighters fed the circle. The founder relics, ripped from history and pressed into service, pulsed like hearts dragged into the wrong body. He thought of Lily, not as symbol, not as photograph, as the shape of a choice. No bargain, no permission, no surrender of another life in place of one's own. Harry stepped forward into the circle. "No!" Sirius shouted. Morwen's eyes widened a fraction. She had wanted prey. Choice altered the spell even before words did. Harry raised his bleeding arm. Rain washed the blood down to his fingers. "Take it then," he said, voice shaking and steady both. "But you take it because I give it to protect them, not because you've won anything." The world seemed to stop. Hermione looked up from the runes with sudden understanding so fierce it was almost terror. Albus's face changed. Snape, locked wand to wand with Lucius, bared his teeth in something like grim hope. Ginny, mud-splashed and panting, whispered his name. Morwen snarled. "You arrogant child." "Maybe," Harry said, "but you're still begging death to make you queen." He cut his own palm wider with the edge of a broken stone and let the blood fall deliberately into the circle. Magic changed direction. The red runes flared white. The cup rang like struck silver, and spilled not fire but clear water across the trench. The locket's green burned inward instead of out, turning sharp as serpent eyes. The diadem blazed above Morwen's head like winter wisdom, and the ring in Albus's hand, the black stone at its center, old beyond families and thrones alike, grew suddenly heavy with a grief that was not despair. Albus turned the stone. The dead did not return. They never could. But the night filled with presences thin as breath on glass and undeniable as memory. A woman with Lily's eyes, a laughing young man with James' untidy hair, a long line of faces lost to the First War, to prisons, to choices made in courage and terror both. They did not come to fight. They came to witness. The captives stopped whimpering. Fear changed texture. It became sorrow, then defiance. Morwen screamed. Her spell, designed to enthrone the self through public dread, found instead a field of people reminded that love survives as obligation among the living, and not as fuel for tyrants. The relics answered accordingly. Hufflepuff's cup poured protection. Ravenclaw's diadem cut through the false logic of domination. Slytherin's locket meant for cunning, rejected stupidity disguised as ambition. And the ring, whatever it had been before it entered gaunt hands, stood with death accepted, not conquered. The throne behind Morwen split. Roots thrashed. Marble burst. Lucius fled and was taken from behind by Snape's curse. Sirius dragged Cedric and the captives clear as the circle convulsed. Hermione screamed at Ron to pull the cup free. He did so with a burn that scarred his palm instantly. Ginny seized the locket with dragonhide gloves and hurled it from the pillar. Harry snatched the diadem as it fell. Morwen, her face suddenly years older under the rain, reached for Harry with both hands. "I could have ended all of it," she cried. "Grief, compromise, fear." "No," Harry said. "You just wanted everyone else to feel them under your name." Albus's final spell hit her as the ring shattered in his hand. It was not green. It was not cruel. It was brilliant, terrible gold, and it struck through the collapsing rite like daylight entering a buried room. Morwen's body arched. For one instant she seemed transparent, every ambition in her visible as a cage built inside human flesh. Then the cage failed. She fell backward into the ruins of her throne, and the magic consuming it consumed her too, aging, unraveling, reducing her to something smaller than a body and larger than ash, a shape of dust blown apart by rain. Silence took the graveyard in a single swallowing breath. Then people began sobbing, laughing, coughing, calling the names of the living to make sure they remained among them. Harry stood in mud and blood and ruin with the diadem in one hand, and Ginny's fingers suddenly, fiercely closed around the other. Tom had died years before in a nursery. His last inheritor had died here, not because death can be mastered, but because she had mistaken mastery for worth. Dawn found them not in triumph but in aftermath, which is a colder and more honest country. The ministry could no longer deny anything. Too many witnesses, too many bodies, too many names above reproach or influence caught kneeling in the mud of Little Hangleton with dark runes on their hands. Lucius, stripped at last of distance and plausible regret, was taken under heavy guard before sunrise. His expression as he passed Harry held no dignity now, only the stunned resentment of a man who had always believed consequences were for other families. Several of Morwen's closest followers died in the graveyard. Others, more frightened than faithful by the end, surrendered wand first and babbling. Cedric, bloody and furious, gave testimony so clear and public that even the prophet could not decorate it into something easier to swallow. Albus buried the fragments of the ring himself. He said little while doing it. Harry, who had seen the shades in the graveyard and understood enough not to ask the questions grief only worsens, stood with him in the early light on a hill above Hogwarts, where the earth was soft from recent rain. The black stone had cracked through its center when the rite collapsed. Whatever ancient power had lived in it had been spent on witness, not conquest. "I was tempted by it for many years," Albus said at last, turning the broken gold band in his fingers before lowering it into the ground. "Not to rule, merely to see again. One must be very careful with the word merely." Harry looked out over the castle roof, silvering in morning. "You didn't use it for that." "No." A pause. "I nearly would have once. That is the sort of truth one owes oneself if one intends to remain decent." He covered the grave with earth and pressed his palm once to the damp soil. Nothing rose. Nothing should. Yet the air around them felt peaceful in a way Harry did not entirely know how to describe, as if some old argument had finally been answered without being won. The relics were taken not to hidden vaults but to studied, guarded care. The cup and locket, once recovered and examined, were removed from all private possession. The diadem returned to Hogwarts for a time, then later to a warded museum Albus insisted be public enough to prevent the corruption secrecy invites. Tom had collected them as instruments. Morwen had tried to enthrone herself upon them. In the end, it seemed right that they be treated as inheritance rather than leverage. Snape survived, though only just. The duel with Lucius left a curse burn down one side of his neck and a limp that appeared in bad weather and during inspections, when he was most annoyed to discover he possessed it. Public opinion treated him with the kind of confused hostility reserved for men who cannot be neatly categorized as heroes without unsettling too many old narratives. He did not care in the least, which was perhaps why Harry began, slowly, to respect him in a way childhood had not allowed. Their peace remained barbed. It was peace, nonetheless. Sirius moved through the aftermath like someone simultaneously vindicated and exhausted by the cost of being right too late. He drank too much the first week, then less after Remus threatened to hex every bottle in his house into ink. He laughed with Harry often, and cried once in private, thinking no one heard, over a photograph of James and Lily at 21. Harry heard and pretended he had not, because love sometimes means preserving a person's dignity from your own tenderness. Ron bore a scar on his palm from wrenching the cup free of the rite, a pale crescent that he alternately bragged about and denied caring for. Hermione, who had quite literally rewritten half the runes under fire, received formal recognition from 3 departments and still found time to bully the ministry into educational reforms under the pretense of helping. Ginny kissed Harry in the corridor outside the hospital wing on the 3rd day after the battle, quick and furious and certain, as if merely correcting a delay both of them had finally lost patience with. Neville's grandmother announced at breakfast that heroism in her family was apparently hereditary after all, and made him turn scarlet in front of everyone. There were funerals, because no victory worthy of the word avoids them entirely. A hit witch from magical law enforcement. An old shopkeeper who had smuggled messages through Nocturne Alley with more courage than training. 2 of Morwen's followers barely older than students, dead because ideology had dressed itself as purpose in their emptiness. Harry stood at each service and felt the weight of what had been prevented without losing sight of what had been lost. The public wanted stories. It always did. Some wanted Harry again as legend, the boy who ended one war in a crib and prevented another in a graveyard. Some tried to elevate Morwen into a grand menace so that defeating her would sound cleaner and more dramatic than admitting how near ordinary institutions had come to serving her by cowardice. Albus resisted both narratives whenever he could. "She was dangerous," he said once to a room full of reporters whose quills scratched like insects. Not because she was extraordinary, but because many people found parts of her reasoning convenient. That sentence caused more outrage than any dazzling retelling of the battle could have done. Harry loved him for it. School resumed, because life's most radical habit is continuation. The first morning back, Hogwarts felt bruised but standing. Students drifted into the great hall in twos and threes, voices subdued, robes still smelling faintly of travel and ash. The enchanted ceiling held a clear autumn sky. Benches scraped. Toast appeared. Someone dropped a goblet and swore. Ordinary noise returned by degrees, embarrassed at first, then bolder. Harry walked in with Ron, Hermione, Ginny, and Neville, and had the sudden sharp impression that peace was not a state into which a country settled once and for all. It was a practice. It was breakfast after terror. It was homework after funerals. It was trusting the staircases again. It was teachers marking essays while politics raged elsewhere. It was people choosing, daily and often without applause, not to hand their fear to anyone promising grandeur in exchange. He understood then something crucial about the difference between Tom and every person who had defeated his legacy. Tom had feared death enough to organize his life around humiliating it. He had mistaken the refusal to end for the right to dominate. Because he would not divide his soul, he died outright in Godric's Hollow. Because he feared mortality still, he left behind papers full of schemes that tried to make intactness itself a weapon. Morwen read those schemes and saw genius where there had really been terror dressed elegantly. She tried to complete what he began, and failed for the same reason he had always been doomed to fail. No magic built on turning other people into instruments can understand the force that comes from treating them as ends in themselves. Lily had not beaten him with superior power. She had beaten him by refusing the bargain at the center of his worldview. Years later, standing once more in Godric's Hollow beside the graves, Harry finally understood the full size of that gift. He went there on a quiet afternoon after term ended. The village gentle under winter light, church bells carrying thin over the roofs. Ginny came with him, and Sirius, and after a moment's hesitation, Remus too. Snow lay in old folds along the stone edges of the churchyard. Their boots made a clean crunch on the path. Harry stood before the marker bearing his parents' names and let silence arrive without feeling the need to fill it. He had imagined as a child that knowing more would simplify grief. It had not. Knowledge had only given the lost contours, turned it from myth into people. James reckless and laughing, Lily fierce and clear-eyed. A house that smelled of stew. A nursery. A choice. The dead did not become lighter because one could describe them better. They became dearer. Sirius touched the top of the stone with 2 fingers and looked away toward the village. Remus stood with his hands in his pockets, face lifted to the pale sun. Ginny slipped her hand into Harry's and held on. At length Harry knelt and brushed snow from the carved letters. The lightning scar on his brow pulled slightly in the cold, no more significant now than any old wound except in what it reminded him of. It was not a tether. It was not destiny. It was a mark left by a night when 2 opposing beliefs about power had met in one room, and love had proved itself the more fundamental law. He rose, turned, and looked back over the graves and the village and the far fields beyond. The wizarding world would not become perfect. Ministries would go stupid again. Newspapers would lie. Ambitious people would continue mistaking control for wisdom. Children would have to be taught and retaught the shapes in which old evil returned. Someday another frightened, brilliant person might go into a library and ask the wrong question beautifully. Nothing about history guaranteed permanent sense. But there would also be breakfasts and classrooms and jokes on staircases and hands reached out in corridors and letters kept in boxes and friends who crossed countries because one another mattered. There would be people like Hermione who answered lies with thought, like Ron who answered them with stubborn loyalty, like Ginny who answered with action before self-consciousness could interfere, like Neville who turned long-suffering into courage, like Luna who kept the world strange enough that certainty never wholly petrified it, like Sirius and Remus and even Severus, who proved that adulthood, however damaged, could still choose decent. Harry breathed in cold air that smelled of snow and distant wood smoke. Behind him, the church bell began another hour. Beside him, Ginny's grip tightened once, light and sure. Then he left the graves and walked back toward the living, carrying no prophecy, no hidden fragment, no unfinished war. Only the knowledge that peace had to be made and remade by human beings, willing to keep choosing one another over every glittering form of fear.